This is a screencast for Caesar de Bello Gallico, Book 4, Chapter 32. In this section, Caesar and his men are overcome by what they've been preparing for such a long time, a renewed attack by the Britons. To start the translation, dum ea geruntor, with a geruntor being a historical present verb, while these things were being done with one legion, which was called the seventh, out of custom, having been sent to get grain, with a fermentatum being a supine and the accusative case, we know that supines help to express purpose, so in this case the purpose is to get grain, neque illa, and not with any suspicion of war, having been admitted ad tempus at this time cum pars hominum, when part of the men in agris remaneret remained in the fields, pars etiam, a part also was coming back and forth into the camp. Another way to translate the ventitaret would be repeatedly. So a part also was coming repeatedly into the camp. What Caesar's doing here with the neque ulla ad tempus belli suspicione interposita is he's describing his soldiers, who, unlike himself, don't have any real suspicions about war. In all of chapter 31, Caesar talks about his suspicions of a British attack due to the destruction of his ships and the small size of his camps. But his men, they're expecting nothing. They have zero suspicions, and knowing how this chapter ends, that could be a real issue. These men, these men who were in post in statione erant, in front of the gates of the camp, proportis castrorum Caesari nuntiaverant, announced to Caesar that poverem maiorum, that greater dust, quam consuetude ferat, that greater dust than regular operations would produce, in ea parte, in this part, was seen, videri. The poverem here, this whole section, the poverem, this whole section right here, that is an indirect statement, with the poverem being the subject of videri, and the quam consuetude ferat being a subordinate clause within this indirect statement. They announced to Caesar that greater dust than regular operations would produce, in this part, was seen, quam in partem, in which direction legio iter fecesset, the legion, in which direction the legion had made a journey. So basically, this is the equivalent of seeing tire tracks. If you were on a trail and you saw tire tracks, that would cause some suspicion about someone or something lurking in the area. So Caesar and his men are suspecting someone to be lurking among their camps. Moving on to the next slide. Caesar, having suspected in advance this thing which was happening, aliquid novi ab barbaris initum concilii, some new plan was begun by the barbarians. He ordered the cohorts which were on guard duty in stationibus erant, who were on guard duty, to set out with him into this direction and eam partem, ex reliquis, from those remaining, from those left, 2 cohorts to follow into post, the rest to be armed and immediately follow close subsequently to the rest to be armed and immediately follow close after him. All these verbs here are complementary infinitives. Moving on to the next slide. Come, when he had proceeded farther by a little from the camps, he animadvertit, he noticed that his men were attacked by the enemy and were scarcely holding up, because the legion was holding together. Conferte legione, this is an ablative absolute. The process cesset is a subjunctive in a temporal clause, and this suos, this from suos, all the way down to koiki here, that is an indirect statement, all of which is dependent on the animad vertit. So they were scarcely holding up because a legion was crowded together. Weapons were being thrown ex omnibus partibus, from all parts. Nam quod, for because, omni ex reliquis partibus demesso frumento, this is a gigantic ablative absolute. So, for because, with all the grain having been harvested from the rest of the regions, one part, pars una erat reliqua, one part was remaining. Hostes, the enemy, having suspected that to this place our men would come, hid in the woods at night. So yeah, basically Caesar and his men are being attacked. The soldiers had no real suspicions, but this is exactly what Caesar saw coming. This hoc nostros esse venturos. This is all an indirect statement dependent on suspicati. And we'll move on to the next slide. Tum dispersos. Then, having suddenly attacked dispersos, our dispersed men, depositus armis, this is an ablative absolute, after they put down their weapons, or another way to translate this would be with weapons having been put aside, in mettendo occupatos, occupied in harvesting, paucis interfectis, another abab, with a few having been killed, they had thrown the rest, another incertis ornibus, they had thrown the rest into confusion with uncertain lines. Simul, at the same time, they had surrounded with equitatu atque essedis, they had surrounded with cavalry and war chariots. So yes, Caesar and his men had been completely surrounded by the Britons. And that is chapter 32 of Book 4.